All right, so I'm happy to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. So Jennifer Wagner is the Associate Director for Bioethics Research at Geisinger and an Assistant Professor in the Center for Translational Bioethics and Healthcare Policy. In addition to her research, she also has been running her own boutique private law practice in State College since 2007. So she's one of these JD PhDs. So she got her JD at the University of North Carolina in 2007, and then her PhD in anthropology at Penn State in 2010, and then she did postdoctoral fellowships at Duke and also at the University of Pennsylvania. She currently has a K99R00 from NHGRI. So she does a lot of research in a wide variety of areas, race, ancestry, appearance, that's what her K99 is largely about, improving care for trafficked persons, historical and emerging vulnerable populations, including prisoners and employees and athletes, perspectives on DNA identification technologies and their utility in law enforcement, so a lot of different areas. Prior to joining Geisinger, Jen served on a U.S. Senator's office in Washington, D.C. as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. And last month, she just found out that she was selected for the Emerge Pennsylvania 2018 cohort. This is a group of women selected for training for potential futures in government. So Jen is an excellent speaker and a former colleague and a good friend and hopefully future collaborator. So I'm really glad that she's here with us at PSB. And please give her a warm PSB welcome.
Thank you. That was a lovely introduction. Thanks so much. And thank you to all the organizers for the opportunity to speak here today and give the LC keynote. I'm honored. It's been a great conference, and who doesn't love mimosas with your talk? So I thought it would be appropriate to kick off the year with a discussion of discrimination and equity for two reasons. And the first is that 2018 marks the 10th anniversary of the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA. And secondly, that the United States this year will be reviewed for its compliance with the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Now, being my first PSB conference, I wasn't sure what to expect. I gotta be honest, I still don't feel quite so comfortable not having a suit to give this keynote. But I listened, and I seem to be dressed appropriately. The light looks nice with this. Now, I wasn't sure how exactly to prepare for this conference, and fortunately for me, PSB proceedings are online, so I did what any good anthropologist would do, and I looked for data, and I performed a systematic keyword search. Now, let me first give my disclaimers and disclosures. Just information as is, I'm not your attorney, I'm not Geisinger's attorney. These views are my own, and Marilyn already mentioned my conflicts. So I performed a systematic keyword search on each of the year's proceedings to see how much coverage there might have been in this area so far. And let me just dispel any potential misunderstanding. I did not include this slide to suggest that I'm being critical of PSB or that there's been scant coverage. Actually, the organizers having an LC keynote, I think, is a testament to them valuing this important work. You know, I think more to my point, surveying mere titles for sessions and papers is a superficial assessment that couldn't possibly uncover the full content of the underlying character of the proceedings. So this is a bit of a silly way to warn about data fundamentalism and essentializing data. But it did suggest that this would be a decent topic to cover, and I hope you were able to see the full proceedings. Carlos Bustamante, his keynote on Thursday, in which he asked you to all see your role in policy and call out the bullshit in data mining. The Disparities session on Friday with Vince Bonham's important talk about prioritizing diversity, and the democratization of data session that included John Wilbanks and his underscoring of the importance of design thinking and seeing the human subject as a person, first and foremost. Those are tough acts to follow, and I know that there will be a diversity workshop later today, so hopefully the talk will continue. Now, before I get into the substance of my talk, I just wanted to take a moment to share with you a graphic illustration that I've been preparing for a publication actually focused for physical anthropologists and anthropological geneticists to get them thinking about how they connect to ethics, law, and policy, and I think it's applicable to you too. So I unapologetically want to recruit you to be a radical collaborator with me and my colleagues in ELSI. And ELSI is the Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications, if you're not familiar with that acronym. I want you to think about moving along the spectrum from the lower portions of the blue as passive receivers of codes of ethics and professional norms, and move into the elevated, enlightened space of actually being influencers and creators of those norms and policies. So if you can't see in the back, we're looking at the engagement with ethics, law, and policy. The different columns are type, approach, intensity, and frequency, and you move up, hopefully, to this top right corner. Now, to draw inspiration from Seth Godin, I want you to think about what to do when it's your turn, and know that it's always your turn. You each and collectively have a very important role in determining how big data will shape our society. Now, I want to start by just sharing with you some of my perspectives on big data, specifically for precision health and medicine, to get you thinking about some of the challenges that I'm constantly trying to figure out. So we're looking extraordinarily in-depth inside. We're looking inside the clinic, extrapolating phenotypes from EHR data. We're looking at more data inside the body than ever before. Larry Small's talk this morning was a perfect example of that. But we're also looking outside. We're increasingly turning to data sources that are generated outside the clinic and outside that encounter that you might have with a doctor when something goes wrong. So we're looking outside the clinic to non-traditional data sources generated for other purposes under different regulatory regimes and by diverse and perhaps even unknown entities. We're looking outside the body to behavior and lifestyle, to the environment, social determinants of health. We're trying to make the most of what we can. We're not limiting ourselves to insights derived from traditional clinical data, clinical test results generated by FDA-approved medical devices, but also looking for insights from wearables, from apps, monitors, you name it. But we're also looking upside down. We're trying to consider not just the tests, the devices, the priorities of the trained, licensed investigator and medical clinician. We are recognizing the importance of patient perspectives and their priorities. We're pushing towards a partnership and shared decision-making in research and innovative care. And what health outcomes are desired? What measures might be off the table? We're looking for ways to build durable relationships with trust and loyalty. Yet there are recognizable challenges and opportunities in integrating inside, outside, upside down data. And these issues include perceptual issues, for example, the optics, related to attitudes and behaviors and norms. For example, will patient participants view the integration of grocery store data or housing data as welcomed customization or perhaps intrusive surveillance? So at Geisinger, I like to ask this question, is it caring data or creepy data? There are also scientific issues at play related to concerns that non-traditional data might somehow lower scientific rigor in terms of data quality, data quantity, or other priorities. There's somewhat of a reluctance by researchers and clinicians to some degree, perhaps not those of you in this room, but others, that stems from concerns about undermining their expertise and authority to make the decision. There are legal and regulatory issues related to real and perceived obstacles, including difficulties with conflicting obligations related to the data, concerns about expanding liability and burdens on the research enterprise. For example, if you have an algorithm that provides a medical recommendation, Who's going to be held accountable if there's a problem? Where will medical malpractice extend? There are logistical and practical issues related to genuine, authentic engagement, recognizing the diverse needs and interests of individuals, families, and communities. Now, I'm going to argue that patient-centeredness and patient engagement is precisely what will allow us to make mistakes. It will enable you to be bold. It will enable you to engage in those disruptive innovations that we don't know whether or not they will work. I think it's worth noting that having clear and honest communication and trusting relationships are essential to minimizing the medical and the legal liability risks. Now, you know all the opportunities, so I don't have to spend a large amount of time talking about them. But I do want to highlight 3 specific concerns. The first is that we do see this push, this necessity for an expanded access to data, to information, to the knowledge. This has undeniable implications for privacy protections, as increased information could both positively and negatively affect participants. Second, the existing disparities among protected classes, which include but are not limited to racial and ethnic minorities, even though that's the focus of my talk, could become exacerbated. And third, we see this increase in dependence on information and connected technology. Now, a number of people have remarked about the dangers of this, including Maynard Olson, who lamented the obvious risk that healthcare systems and IT companies will join forces and cut the academic researchers out. It's a legitimate concern, in my view. The data disparities that could result from this focus on technology-dependent approach are not just the creation of the haves and have-nots for researchers, but also create serious concerns, for example, about varying standards of care for data-rich and data-poor patients. So the lens with which we think about data disparities is important. The gap of the data-rich and the data-poor, the data haves and the data have-nots, could be striking. And we need to decide what level of inequality we are willing to accept as just part of the process, as a business necessity, so to speak. Now, there are data disparities between individuals, that is the patients and the participants, that can affect the standards of care that are even possible. There are data disparities between those researched and those researching when we have a patient partner in that research effort. Data disparities also exist between institutions, and I think you all are aware of that, and can bring small business versus mega corporation dynamic that could have quite perverse and far-reaching effects on research, innovation, and medicine. Now, data disparities potentially limit enforcement opportunities and prevent us from otherwise optimizing the benefits and the risks for all of our human family. Now, before the administration changed, the White House issued a 2016 report that acknowledged specifically the big risks that big data could pose to civil rights, warning that algorithmic systems, if we're not careful and deploy equal opportunity by design, could exacerbate existing disparities and could re-encode bias, thereby perpetuating the wrongs of the past. The report focused on data inputs and data outputs, the inner workings of the algorithms, and it underscored the importance of transparency, accountability, and the due process mechanisms wherever possible. But is that sufficient? I would argue that perhaps not. The FTC also recognized some of the dangers and has issued a report as well. This particular report called into question what data scientists should be doing, should be asking themselves. And they gave 4 basic questions. How representative is your data set? Does your data model account for biases? How accurate are your predictions based on big data? And does your reliance on big data raise ethical and fairness concerns? Now, the FTC's role, you might be confused as to why they're even involved in this. They're not generally seen as the agency to regulate medicine or research. But Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act actually prohibits unfair and deceptive trade practices. And data privacy and security that are inadequate could be violations of that section. Moreover, the FTC is tremendously important for oversight of direct-to-consumer companies' internet commerce. And so it's not surprising that they're getting involved in this game. But let's take a quick look at some of the legal authorities applicable to the United States to promote fairness. Now, I recognize that this review is US-centric, and I apologize for that, but the complexities, I think, warrant that narrow lens. Now, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted and proclaimed a number of things, including Article 7, that all are entitled to equal protection of the law without any discrimination, Article 12, that they're all entitled to freedom from arbitrary interference from privacy and attacks upon honor and reputation. In Article 27, everyone has the right to freely share in scientific advancement and its benefits. Now, the US, and specifically Eleanor Roosevelt, were instrumental in leading the world in human rights issues and creating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, we have the US Constitution. I'm sure most of you know it has equal protection and due process clauses, but it's important to remember that the Constitution itself only restricts governmental action. It doesn't restrict private action at all unless Congress decides that it should and adopts statutes that extend those principles. This is one of the reasons why the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was so vital in moving our country forward, albeit incrementally. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 included notably a ban on discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Title II regarding discrimination in public accommodations like restaurants or hotels. Title VI regarding discrimination in federally assisted programs. So any program or service that receives federal funding can be caught with this mechanism. And Title VII regarding discrimination in employment. Around the same time period, so the 1960s, the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, or ICERD, was adopted by the UN and open for signature in 1965. It actually was enacted entered into force, in 1969. It was signed by the US in 1968, but was not ratified until 1994. Now, the significance of that is pretty important because the ratification process is actually what, pursuant to Article 6 of the Constitution, gives this binding force as law of the land. No different than a Supreme Court ruling, no different than a US statute. And the countries that actually sign on and ratify this treaty are reviewed for their compliance on a regular basis, somewhat similar to the Olympics, right? Every 4 years, give or take. Now, in the preamble of CERD, it actually recognized that racial discrimination in all of its forms is an obstacle to friendly and peaceful relations among nations and is capable of disturbing peace and security among peoples and the harmony of persons living side by side even within one and the same state. Human rights are interdependent, they are indivisible, and interrelated. And that's why you see CERD actually extends this right to be free from racial discrimination across all sectors of society, from employment to movement to administration of justice and the like. Now, in 2008, when the US was reviewed for its compliance, the committee actually issued a number of conclusions that included, among other things, that the US needed to do more to prohibit discriminatory impacts, not just discriminatory laws, to adopt and strengthen the use of special measures to eliminate disparities, to eliminate obstacles to adequate health care for minorities, and to adopt federal legislation to end racial profiling. We were reviewed again in 2014. Again, we were told you need to take concrete steps to prohibit racial discrimination in all its forms, including indirect discrimination, and cover all fields of law and public life. This includes, specifically, to improve health and healthcare to address disparities, including both access and affordability for racial and ethnic minorities, undocumented, and sexual and reproductive health. Now, it included a number of other conclusions as well, like addressing disproportionate impacts of environmental pollution, which obviously is a social determinant of health or an environmental factor that influences health. At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that 2018 brings with it a new review. We're going to be reviewed. The current administration was supposed to issue its report to CERD in November. And I'm sure we could place bets about what the committee is going to tell us. I'm willing to bet that they're going to tell us we're not doing enough and that we probably are actually taking steps backwards. Now, there are other additional Civil Rights Act, equally important, but not the focus necessarily of this talk. And that includes protected classes of age, disability, and sex. Precision medicine approaches actually rely heavily on genetics and genomics. So before I move on, I do want to just mention a few that I think you should be aware of. Now, there's a Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights. It was adopted unanimously 20 years ago in 1997 by UNESCO. Article 12 actually suggests that we have benefits from advances in biology, genetics, and medicine concerning the human genome shall be made available to all with due regard for the dignity and human rights of each individual. And Article 2 includes that everyone has a right to respect for their dignity and for their rights regardless of their genetic characteristics. Now, coincidentally, this past October, the State Department announced its plans to withdraw from UNESCO and explained that it wished to be a non-member observing state. Now, the withdrawal will take effect later this year, and as a non-member observer, we no longer will have a right to vote. We will just simply take part in the discussions. There's the International Declaration on Human Genetic Data that was adopted in 2003. Again, Article 7 includes the importance of non-discrimination rights. Article 13 reiterates the importance of data access to the individual. And this declaration is non-binding, okay? Most international treaties are. And it's intended to shape social norms, but does not obligate states to enact enforceable rules. The Congress is, when the Congress ratifies the treaty, that's when they're actually obligating the country to take steps in some of these actions. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. On previous occasions, I've explained this act as minimal protections, but maximum publicity. It was largely symbolic, but nevertheless took 13 years to become law. And it prohibits genetic discrimination, but only in health insurance contexts and employment. Now, just this week, my esteemed colleague Barbara Evans wrote a very important piece for the American Journal of Human Genetics that I encourage you all to check out, in which she makes the argument that I happen to agree with, that like the right to vote, access to one's own genomic data is a foundational civil right that empowers people to protect all of their other civil rights. It's indivisible. It's interrelated. And she notes that HIPAA displaced the state's power to interfere with it. Now, this is important because the states are actually what typically regulate and control the practice of medicine. Now, President Obama signed the Affordable Care Act in March 2010 that protected individuals from health insurance discrimination on the basis of pre-existing conditions or health status. And it contains a very important non-discrimination provision that I'll talk about in a little bit later, Section 1557. So whereas GINA said that your genetic information could not be considered a pre-existing condition, the Affordable Care Act went a bit further and said, and your pre-existing conditions cannot be used to deny coverage. So there's kind of like a broad overview of some of the important civil rights acts that I think are implicated by data mining and big data and precision health, precision medicine. And you'd say, well, goodness, we have all of these laws, we have all of these norms. Haven't we solved it? But we know that racial disparities persist. Okay, our dark past interferes and clouds our future. So we've seen headline after headline noting the dramatic effect of your zip code on your health. Why is this? This is not a coincidence. We have a history of redlining in the United States, which is the denial of services based on your geographic location. Largely, it was based on race and the character of the communities and the populations that inhabited them. there is a new map that's available from Mapping Inequality that talks about the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which in the 1930s actually graded neighborhoods. They gave them 1 of 4 grades. Okay, you could be the best in green, you could be still desirable in blue, you could be definitely declining in yellow, and you could be hazardous in red. And often the comments, the free text responses that they could put in as to justifications as to why a particular neighborhood got a particular grade was specifically because of race. Okay, now Ta-Nehisi Coates poignantly points out, until we reckon with our compounding moral debts, America will never be made whole. Racial disparities exist in genetic databases and in information gleaned therefrom. There's underrepresentation in biomedical research databases. That means that the, individuals in these populations potentially aren't able to enjoy the same level of benefits that could come from the research as non-minorities. Overrepresentation in the forensics databases, by contrast, suggests that they bear many more risks, potentially. So I will also note that prison populations, again, which reflect the disproportionate criminal justice system and law enforcement, or selective law enforcement, actually is a problem as well. Okay, so we have regulations in place that prevent prisoners from being participants in research. They have a juridic disability, so to speak. And there are very good reasons for this. Historically, there were a lot of exploitative research projects, including testing drugs, cosmetics, and all sorts of chemical agents. And we want to protect this captive population from those harms. But what about an observational study like the Precision Medicine Initiative? Right? Why shouldn't they be able to contribute to the betterment of society in that way? Genetic technologies offer a powerful means to potentially mitigate racial disparities. For example, if computer-assisted decision-making could reduce racial profiling. But if we're not careful, it could really exacerbate the problems. Now, the US Census tool is an important survey to enable us to track our progress on reducing disparities and inequalities, among other things. Yet the census itself has changed over time. It's not static. And the proposed changes for the 2020 census are not without controversy. Surveys, including census survey, can go horribly wrong if questions are perceived by those who are supposed to respond to the survey as being motivated by discriminatory animus. For example, asking them if they're citizens. Trust and understanding of why you're asking for that information is key. Trust and understanding of what you're going to do with that information is key, and will affect the respondent's willingness to answer specific questions. Now, biomedical research requires consistent classification of participants. We see this all the time. Yet placement of an individual whose parents identify or are classified into different groups is inherently problematic to researchers. You have to make choices about whether to classify the individual as a member of one group, as a member of both groups, as a member of yet another group that's a combination of those groups. You could allow the individual to self-identify. You could exclude the individual from research altogether. And this classification process actually masks the underlying variation, and I know you're all familiar with this. So big data has the opportunity to potentially try to resolve some of this by not setting a priori, defining characteristics, but we need to understand what exactly your approaches are doing. Okay, we need to know what that mysterious black box is, because the legal community, I can assure you, has no clue. Nevertheless, tracking has important implications for understanding minority groups' ability to mobilize and actually protect their own rights. And so it's important for helping us to understand what policies need to be kind of forced upon everyone versus, okay, this is a problem and we'll take steps to try to minimize it, but leaving you to your independent behaviors. Now I want to return for a moment to the slide that I showed earlier about the different kinds of data, the non-traditional data sources that we're considering in precision medicine and precision health. In a scientific paradigm that acknowledges the interplay of nature and nurture in the development or the manifestation of a disease in any particular individual, and uses this in a big data context, we perhaps now see every kind of data as potentially relevant for health inferences, right? Environmental data, geolocation data, retail and consumer data, relationship data, financial data, you name it, it could be considered. Now, in the European Union, they protect privacy using an umbrella comprehensive approach. There's a new law that will take effect this year as well, the General Data Protection Regulation, and this is an attempt to harmonize the rules across Europe. But in contrast to Europe, the US doesn't take that approach. The US protects privacy in a sector-by-sector specific way. This might have made sense when data came in dribbles, right? When it was a discrete transfer of information. But when data flows continuously in real time at different speeds, in multiple directions, the situation gets a little bit more complicated. We're in this situation of not data scarcity, but data abundance. And that abundance is what makes it more difficult for us to filter, for us to focus. So the problem isn't about identifying what is relevant. The problem for us is identifying, even if something is relevant, it should nevertheless be off the table because of its role in possible discrimination or preventing us from achieving fairness. Now, big data for precision medicine is changing the way we conceive of data. The increased information, as I said before, increases risks and benefits. And as many legal scholars, including Jessica Roberts at the University of Houston Law School, has recognized, privacy and non-discrimination work in a somewhat symbiotic way. Okay, so privacy focuses on control, right? Controlling the access to the information. And non-discrimination is controlling the use of the information. And so in that regard, privacy is in some ways a means to try to help with non-discrimination by minimizing the people who have access to those data. But in a big data world and the need for transparency, this is going to be coming into question because you'll have many, many parties seeing data, and what does that mean? So I want you to keep that in mind as we move forward. So there's no specific federal right to genetic privacy or data privacy in the United States, although there is a right to access to genetic information afforded by HIPAA amendments, as Barbara Evans noted. We deal with genetic information and personal genomics, just broadly speaking, regardless of the context, in a number of ways. We have this alphabet soup, right? So I point this out to show that in the US, we have a society that continues to reflect what was the progressive vision of the 1930s of the New Deal. And multiple agencies have their hands in some aspect of oversight, but they're in slightly different spheres. Too many of us, I would argue, are content to let an agency take control, let an agency assert some kind of authority, even if Congress has not delegated it to them. Because we're worried about Congress doing nothing, and we see the need for something to be done. Yet that result, I would argue, actually lets our elected officials off the hook. It allows them to do nothing. And it prevents us from understanding when marquee legislation, comprehensive legislation, is necessary, and what shape that legislation should take. So boundaries are breaking down all over the place, okay? We have learning healthcare systems like Geisinger who are actively trying to break down that wall between the distinction of patients and participants. Patient or participant partnered research and citizen science is breaking down that wall between researchers and the researched. But we also have the data breaking down. So if we protect health data because it's health data, at what point do non-traditional data sources become sufficiently relevant to precision medicine and health, or are used so frequently for those purposes they should be transformed in some way, some legal fiction exercise, into protected health information? What types of data and inferences should be available for governmental surveillance, for public health and safety, and which should be off limits? The blurring boundaries are vexing policymakers, and your help is desperately needed. Okay, so I hope that you will take steps that you can do to help us understand the pipeline, help us understand the workflow, help us understand what's going on, because we need to have governance that is able to address the realities of today and not continue to lock ourselves up in what might have worked 100 years ago when we didn't have the internet, when we didn't have data abundance. There's another type of blurred boundary that I just want to take an opportunity to mention, and that is the protected class itself. So we now know, based on a number of different scientific disciplines, that racial classifications are biocultural constructs that attempt to convert complex, continuous variation into categorical distinctions for simplified processing. We know that sex classifications are likewise biocultural oversimplifications, and the dichotomy is false, even if individuals who are intersex and transsex are sex minorities. Ability and disability, when viewed through a biopsychosocial model, rather than a moral model or a medical model, is not a stark contrast, but a range of possibilities along a spectrum. Genomes can be altered and might not be as immutable or deterministic as they were once believed. Racial and ethnic identity is not static. It's not static across groups. It's not static across an individual's lifetime. Chronological ages and developmental ages are not synonymous, and the demarcation between child and adult for purposes of research is similarly a simplification. But protected classes are set by statute, and they are categorical. Your membership in them is required for you to seek the benefits that they provide you for non-discrimination. And big data has the potential ability to, or perhaps it already has, rendered these categories functionally meaningless. Big data and machine learning make it easier to pick a variable that is not directly membership, right, and base decisions off of that. Yet the variables themselves, if not distributed evenly across the populations, or phrased differently, disproportionately affecting a specific subpopulation, could mask our ability to detect intentional discrimination and provide ready pretext. So we must ask ourselves, can the existing non-discrimination frameworks function effectively in this age? If not, how the heck do we fix it? What is fair? What problems might arise if we keep our heads in the proverbial sand? And at what point are we willing to tolerate discrimination? What is acceptable versus unlawful? So not only are boundaries breaking down, but black boxes abound. You need to explain what is happening in your algorithms, in your methods. The designers have a role to play. The lawyers, the policymakers need to understand. You need to explain it not only to them, you have to explain it to patients, to providers. Black boxes make it extremely difficult to ensure minority rights, human rights, and non-discrimination rights, specifically to which we all are entitled. And with the privatization of that endeavor, there is the concern that this will become increasingly difficult, with companies holding on to proprietary databases and relying upon trade secrets and other intellectual property protections. This will exacerbate data haves and data have-nots. It will make it more difficult to prove when discrimination occurs. Moreover, it's only a matter of time before this legal uncertainty or the legal protections of unknown significance, if you prefer, get challenged in court cases. And so you will be called upon, or your colleagues will be called upon to explain this. So I hope that you will have an answer ready. Now, not every form of discrimination is unlawful, okay? We, in the United States, prohibit intentional discrimination, so disparate treatment, and disparate impact, or discriminatory effects. For intentional discrimination, you actually need to show that there's some sort of discriminatory animus. So there's this spite, this ill will, a prejudice, or you can show that there's been a deliberate indifference. Knowledge that a disparity exists, knowledge that a harm is substantially likely to occur, and yet a failure to do anything about it. Now, disparate impact, on the other hand, doesn't require any intentions. It simply is there to correct implicit and structural biases. So 26 agencies in the US have, or at least, have rules and regulations to help combat unintentional disparate impact discrimination. And they have a crucial role in ensuring that that gets enforced and to ensure that public funds are not used to perpetuate racial discrimination of the past. Now, this was somewhat complicated in 2001 when the Supreme Court, in a majority opinion written by the late Justice Scalia, ruled that private individuals do not have the right to enforce disparate impact discrimination from Title VII, and that only the agencies are the ones that can enforce that. But nevertheless, it is still there. Now, I want to take some time and just ask you to think a little bit more critically about what we mean by equality and equity. I know Vince Bonham in his talk yesterday morning gave you some definitions to help you thinking about disparities, but I want to kind of walk you through a little bit of feminist theory so that you understand that equality and equity are not synonyms, okay? Under formal equality, we view equal opportunity as the goal. And we require the law to ignore any differences. You need to treat everyone the same, okay? Under substantive equality, we still have equal opportunity as the norm, but we reconcile this by saying there are some specific limited differences that we actually need to take into account and provide special accommodations. This is common in sex equality legislation and case law. Now, under a non-subordination or dominance theory, the end goal is equal opportunity and equal outcome. Therefore, the law has an obligation to take difference into account so that appropriate inclusionary measures can be taken to ensure that there is the equal opportunity for the enjoyment. So you probably have seen this image before. It's had many different variations online. And when you walk from the leftmost image to the rightmost image, that's what's taking you through formal equality, substantive equality, and something more towards fairness or equity under a non-subordination or dominance theory approach. Okay, so the importance here is that in the left image, everyone's being treated the same, but they're not enjoying benefits equally. In the middle, everyone's not being treated the same, but they end up having equal opportunity. And in the last image, that mechanism that was there to ensure safety, right, that they're not hit by a ball, that gets hit to the outfield and they can see the game, is changed. You see that instead of an opaque fence, you now have a chain link that enables everyone to enjoy regardless of their difference. Okay? I want you to think about the fact that statutory non-discrimination rights cannot be waived. You can't waive them in an informed consent document. You can't waive them in a contract. You can coincidentally subject them to arbitration, but that's another talk. But how can we do better as a society in addressing not only formal equality, so treating everyone the same, but also equity, that is treating everyone fairly? There's a potential pressure point for change, perhaps accidental. Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act has a non-discrimination provision that incorporates 4 of the underlying civil rights acts into its protected class structure and its mechanisms for enforcement. So race, sex, age, and disability. All right? Now, it also has been interpreted as authorizing a private right of action for disparate impact discrimination on the basis of any criteria enumerated in those underlying statutes. So this may have rescued an individual's right to disparate impact legislation. OCR, HHS, final rules, and commentary suggest that this is intended to apply not just to health, but to research, even though they don't want it to fundamentally alter inclusion and exclusion criteria. So what do we do about this? How does this apply to genetic information? The Genetic Information Act, Non-Discrimination Act, did not include a private right of action for disparate impact, but it did say that, you know what, we can't envision a scenario when this would apply right now, but we should revisit this issue in 6 years. Now, it was enacted in 2008, and so 6 years after that would have been 2014, and a commission to study this was supposed to be impaneled. But it was a bit illusory because it left that job of appointing who would be on this committee to Congress, which we basically can't force them to do anything, right? So the commission, even though it was supposed to begin work in 2014 and issue a report in 2015, still has not been impaneled, okay? So where do we go from here? How do I wrap up this talk so you can enjoy some of the sunshine and lunch? I'm gonna argue that we should be more litigious, not less. Okay, I want to encourage you, whether we're talking about privacy or discrimination, to take control and be an instigator for fairness. Okay, we must encourage policy experimentation, and court cases are a way to do that. There are pilot data. They are what allow us to understand whether laws we have on the books are sufficient, whether they can remedy the harms that we're experiencing or not. They give us clues about what laws are needed that don't already exist. In the case of genetics and genomics, there really hasn't been sufficient numbers of cases. So the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act is 10 years old, but one of my colleagues at an AALS symposium this week, actually, had tweeted, since I'm not there, that's how I learned this, that he was able to identify 16 cases substantively dealing with GINA since its inception. 16 in 10 years, okay? Likewise, we always are hearing about the harms that can't be resolved using underlying common law civil rights torts common law rights torts for privacy. So privacy is protected using 4 different types of legal theories, and we hear, well, it can't handle this kind of data or this kind of big data environment. Now, there are some genuine concerns about that, but the cases just aren't there. We also need to place pressure at all levels of government, state and local government as well. But let's walk through what some of those should look like. So government action is needed. Congress could pass an omnibus bill that protects personal data integrity. So thinking beyond genetic data, but what do we do in a big data world? It could pass an omnibus fairness in genetics bill that would extend genetic non-discrimination rights across the economic sector beyond health insurance and employment. There are some state model legislations that are available to turn to, like CalGINA. Agencies could take meaningful action to enforce the rules that are on the books to eliminate disparate impacts. We could relax regulatory barriers to allow prisoners, inmates, parolees, and others with juridic disabilities to participate, to contribute to this societal group effort, this public good. We could promote open science. You know, we need accountability, we need transparency in order to be able to understand what's going on, understand if rights are being infringed, and there has been a bill floating around for some time. I mentioned a bill to promote fairness in genomics. Likewise, there are examples out there. A colleague of mine, Barbara Preensack, has suggested, you know what, we need a different approach. We need something that is going to enable us to think about difference at the forefront, because we're not all the same. And the risks that we have in this venture for big data used for precision health and medicine are different. And so she argues that we need to facilitate desirable data use, so things that are for the public good. We need to find a way to incentivize that, which she argues would include fewer restrictions from regulations. And we also need to think about harm mitigation. There's no way that we're going to eliminate all the possible harms that are going to come from this. But we should think about harm mitigation funds that could be established in which an independent actor would actually be affiliated with a data controller, and they would adjudicate any grievances of harms. And then finally, we would tax corporate data use that does not meet these desirable use criteria. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this would work. In fact, I think it would be quite difficult in the United States, perhaps more so than in Europe, but it's a useful legal kind of thought exercise for us. But I want to leave you with this message that action is needed from you. You need to help policymakers understand where the lines of fairness and unfairness can be drawn with big data. You need to adopt discrimination-aware strategies. When I was preparing for this talk, was really excited to see that some of your colleagues are actually suggesting that and trying to provide you with practical guidance on how to do that. But I want you to think beyond equal opportunity. I want you to think about equity, okay? I want you to think about what barriers can be removed so that we can treat everyone the same, yet understand that they'll have equal outcomes. I also want you to think about petitioning the agencies, the governmental agencies who are supposed to be keeping tabs on disparate impacts and have not been doing so, because individuals have the right to petition agencies to tell them to do something, and they have to respond when they get a certain number of petitions. And also to support citizen suits in legislation. There are times when your rights are out there. It happens often in environmental policy, and it's very difficult to get the agency to act for whatever reason. I mean, you can blame it on scarce resources for them to do all of the things that they're supposed to be doing with decreasing funds coming in from tax revenues. But you know, we need to get them thinking beyond those priorities, and we need them to do what Congress has told them to do. So citizen suits actually enable private individuals to force them into court, force the agencies into court, to meet deadlines that they're already supposed to meet by statute, and they have fee shifting provisions so that you're not the ones who are burdened by that cost of litigation. There's another way on the horizon. So the FDA is constantly, issuing new guidance, and in December issued draft guidance specifically for clinical decision support software. They're looking at, where do they set that line between enforcement discretion or not as a medical device, so software as a medical device. And they argued that in order for the software function to be excluded from the definition of a medical device, it needs to provide the intended user with the ability to reach the same recommendation on his or her own without relying primarily on the software function. And they tell you that in order for them to be able to do that, you have to explain the software's purpose or the function's purpose, the intended user, the inputs used to generate the output, and the rationale or support for the output. If this is overbroad, if this is over narrow, if this just doesn't make sense at all, I encourage you to submit public comments and to do this regularly. And I'll leave you with this notion that our future is not inevitable. We live in this alphabet soup of agencies that came about in the 1930s, and what was considered progressive then is not what could necessarily be considered progressive today. Now, Vince Bonham used a lovely photo of a path that had a fork, and he encouraged us to choose the right path. I want to push you a little bit further. There is no path. We have to build the path. You have to make the tough decisions. You, as an industry, as a discipline, will set the norms far faster than government can. They will respond to you. We need to look to you. So I'm encouraging you to think about how you and your colleagues, your institution, your research, everything that you do could contribute to a vision of equity in health. How might you think about that? In terms of asking yourself questions about where the right constraints might be placed, you can think about, are there acts that should just not be done, so the act constraint. You can think about whether only certain people, maybe certain people with particular expertise should be able to do certain things. You can think about subject constraints. Are there things or acts that we should not be allowed to do with particular people? This is where you start thinking about vulnerable populations. Or are there objective constraints? Are there things that we just should not try to achieve or intend to do? So I have a lot of questions, but I'd rather let you ask some questions. And I'm just going to end there and thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you about disparities, discrimination, and equity.
Thank you very much, Jen. We can open the floor for questions.
I have a question, but I'm not quite sure how to state it really succinctly. I think this may be something about the constraints that were given by the people we get the data from. Mm-hmm. Carlos talked about someone buying the rights to their genetic markers and in the process selling the rights to their genome. And that seems to me like selling your homeland for a basket of beads. If you don't know the value of what you're selling, then any agreement to sell it seems to me improper, at least.
And there are questions about whether you actually have the right to sell it in the first place. So in the US, we typically don't like slavery and the commodification of body parts.
Yeah.
And there are inconsistencies in that policy, though, and genetic materials and information are one of them that's
Even
not
here,
yet resolved.
some of the international statutes that you mentioned specifically say that you own those rights, you can't sell them. So I'm wondering about that. I'm wondering about, I'm part of a study that looks at the cultural impact of cultural practices on the milk microbiome of humans in Africa, for instance. And the only question we've had about that is, can people tell that whether I've got AIDS from your data? It's like the level of understanding that we presume of the person providing the data may be more than is there and more than can be there. And it's hard enough to explain. So if you say to someone, this is my justification for the diagnosis my software gave you. You've got this variant of this gene, and there's this probability using a Bayesian blah, 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 that such and such will happen. Therefore, you probably, with a probability X, should do that. You're way past them at that point, right? They don't have the understanding of probability. They don't have the understanding of gene variants to make sense of what you have said. So this providing the information to the person that's providing the data, sometimes it's not possible because of the background of the person who gave you the data. And I'm just wondering, could you reflect on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes to equity in education, right? And the importance of bringing everyone in society up to speed as best you can on advances in science and technology. And that's kind of a cop-out answer, right? Yeah. I acknowledge that. But there also are things that you can do to ensure, okay, if there is a trained, learned intermediary, you can do things to help them. I think that Geisinger is struggling with this all the time, right? I mean, we're returning genetic results from research to participants and finding that balance of what will individuals understand, what are really the key points that they need to understand and not get wrong, how can we explain this information to the clinicians who might, or the primary care provider who might be having that conversation, who hasn't had any genetics training at all. There are all sorts of questions. I mean, all I can say is you do the best that you can. And to go back to the importance of patient engagement, right? I can do this in my law practice and say, I will never have a perfect client who understands everything I'm trying to accomplish with their case or understands everything that's intended by the law. They'll have messy facts, might not have the most powerful case, but nevertheless you take them and you be transparent as much as you can. You help bring them along for that ride and they will let you make mistakes. They will trust your expertise, and even if they don't get all of it, they're enabling you and your training to make some decisions with them on their behalf. But I think that communication is really vital, and a lot of times you don't get that. A lot of times you have, in the medical setting, doctors who will say, don't document anything. It's just going to lead to someone being able to point out that you didn't do something or you did something wrong. And I would say it's very important for us to say exactly what was under consideration when we made a certain decision, right? If you took a genetic variant into account and made a medical decision or a medical recommendation, say what that was. You don't have to say that you looked at the entire genome. You can say, in fact, we didn't look at the entire genome. We made a conscious choice that we were balancing resources and obligations, and this is what we considered, and this is the result that we recommended, or the action that we recommended, and you go from there and hope that it's reasonable and within this kind of fuzzy boundary of what's acceptable medical practice.
So just a quick follow-up on that, and if we take seriously what you just recommended, it's going to put a tremendous discriminatory aspect on our research. Because if I can only do the research if I can explain it to the person, I cannot explain to my tribal members in Central Africa what a gene variant is, nor the probability by which this affects their lives. It's not possible given what we've got. And if we wait until people are educated and informed sufficiently enough for that process to work, then there's a bunch of people that are not going to be involved in the data gathering process. And that's a form of discrimination that I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, so I think that's an important point. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't do the research if people don't necessarily understand the ins and outs. I think that is a bit too far. I think that you do the best that you can, right? You recognize that resources are limited. You recognize that you can't do everything that you would want to do. And then, speaking to your point about working in other communities, I think you need to take into account the importance of not doing helicopter research, which I'm not suggesting that you do, but building those resources internally. The H3 Africa and its work to kind of build infrastructure so that the researchers who are in those communities can do the research with those communities, I think is a really important aspect of that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Could you just get a little more granular on what you meant by data disparities among different groups? Do you mean differences in available information, differences in resources, or what is it that makes one group data disparate relative to another group?
Yeah, well, I think that I'm using that language simply from the basis of thinking about who has access to the data, right? So there are people who have access to data and people who don't. There are people who have access to federal research monies to do their research and people who don't. When we don't have public goods, information commons, the risk is that the rich will get richer and the data poor will get poorer because they don't have the tools to do the research to lead to more information, to lead to more knowledge, develop new tools, and the cycle continues. So that's the way that I'm using data disparities in a lot of this talk. I'm also thinking about individuals and their participation in research or their willingness to try different types of care. You know, how do we set that standard? You might have, in a medical context, people who are like, you know what, I don't want you to do something that hasn't been proved. I want you to take a conservative approach. I only want proven care. And you might have others who are like, heck no, you don't know what you're doing with proven care. That's so slow and antiquated. I want you to do what we think is the best thing right now. I want you to do the most progressive, innovative, what's the new technology, what's the new test. And you might have folks in between who are like, well, in some circumstances, I might be willing to take risks for interventions that haven't been proven, but in others, I'm not. And so we need to think about what that means in terms of, you know, who has those data in the electronic health records to even pull from, who's answering the survey, who's not, and the inferences that we draw from those data.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for this great talk. So I was really struck by when you went through all of the civil rights acts that are relevant to doing biomedical research. And I was thinking, well, I actually haven't seen any of these in my education. And so I think we would probably both agree that this is an important part of biomedical education. So rather than complain, I'd like to ask you if you know of any resources or programs that do a good job of integrating these kinds of, you know, regulations and other considerations in the technical biomedical training that we get.
So offhand, no. Offhand, no. Although I will say that the NHGRI does try to do quite a bit of work with the resources that they have online. You can look at agencies like, actually states have, usually have a Human Rights Relations Commission that will kind of set out in a layperson format kind of what the civil rights acts are that might be applicable in that area. The translation is really difficult, right? I mean, it's why I would say, please let me collaborate with you. Let my colleagues collaborate with you, because so much of it really does depend on the actual questions of the project, right? So when I'm thinking about equity, you know, if I'm sitting in conversations about the research design, I might have a whole bunch of other questions for you than what you're thinking about in achieving, you know, how do we answer this question and the like. So I think that NHGRI has some resources, PG Ed has some resources about laws, but otherwise I would say just keep looking for folks like, you know, the people I mentioned in my talk, Barbara Evans, Barbara Prainsack, John Wilbanks, even though he's not an attorney, always has insights. You know, think about Michelle Meyer, who is really great for research ethics, governance kind of issues. Like if we're not having these stark contrasts between research and care, if everything's kind of, okay, well, it's research in care, it's innovative care, what the heck does that mean in terms of compliance with all of these rules? She's really great for that. And I can connect you with people if you have specific questions, or resources if you have specific questions. So please feel free to email me or tweet me. I'm at DNA Lawyer, so.
Thanks.
Sure.
All right, well, in the interest of getting to lunch on time, why don't we give Jen one more round of applause?